This week, Paul and I discuss Agile versus DevOps and where security fits in. In the news, Git has a remote code execution vulnerability, various company solutions to GDPR, and Microsoft acquires GitHub. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/ASW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 18, our 19th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined once again by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadori.
Welcome. Hey, how's it going, Keith?
Good, man. London last week was awesome. I feel refreshed, although I'm sure our listeners were like, what the hell, man? We missed a week. But other than that, I am good. How are you? How have things been?
It's good. Well, last week was Memorial Day. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were off. We were off anyway. So no harm, no foul. The Monday shows are hard because a lot of holidays fall on a Monday. So
True enough.
We will work to reschedule if need be, because I know the Monday shows that tends to happen. So, but yeah, it's good to be here. A lot of exciting news, a lot of it around Git and GitHub, which is interesting.
Yeah.
We've got an exploit and an acquisition, which is all kind of interesting.
Right.
But yeah, things have been going well here around the office. I'm really focused on sales right now, and just getting our sales process and sales deck kind of down. It's amazing how much of a constant process it is. Much like keeping your skills sharp in coding, or working on software and realizing like the next generation. Sales process is the same thing in that vein, right? Like at least me, like when I write code, like in a lot of us too, like we're never really satisfied with what we have. We're always thinking like how we can make it better and constantly working on it. The sales process is the same thing, So, and it's fun, and it's a lot more about psychology than you think, and social engineering, right? That's my talk coming up at SE RI on June 16th in Newport, Rhode Island. It's really making those connections between social engineering, psychology, and behavior, and what we've learned on the sales and business side, and applying those in different ways. So,
and although it's not the formal subject for today's episode, I'm happy to take the tangent, which is sales as a concept is something that's hugely valuable to developers, to security professionals, because to be able to sell the need for either a new tool or more headcount, or heck, even just getting people to fix their bugs, you need to be able to sell that up and across the organization, right? So,
and sell your like architecture ideas is like developers, come to me all the time, like, hey, I think we should like rewrite this or revamp this. And now I'm like, well, how do we justify that? What's the return on investment? And so being able to understand that in that light, that's really the focus of my talk, is so valuable.
Yeah, it's speaking of focus, so segue. Just wanted to talk a little bit about a recent discussion that actually came up while I was on vacation by one of our listeners, whose name is Ryan. He goes by Grog's Axel on Twitter. So he actually posted to Twitter that he had been listening to one of our episodes, and in this case, he thought that we had actually missed something, which is that security professionals should be more involved in the agile process within organizations as opposed to just the DevOps process or the DevOps methods. And so it was interesting because the discussion as it came out, as is linked in the show notes for anyone that wants to go back and read it, was that developers are awarded by story points and more or less work through the process in Jira or some other ticketing system where they can actually track epics and stories and what have you. And that in order for security to be effective in that sort of world, you needed to actually go ahead and have security practitioners involved in the story building process, building malicious user stories and things of that
Wait, hold
nature.
on. Let's back up. So what's the difference between Agile and DevOps?
Which is the whole point of this episode.
Right?
So
Because I'm struggling with it today. So help me out and help our listeners out, Keith.
Sure. So in this case, in the show notes, I've linked to the Agile Manifesto, which is kind of the first formal discussion of Agile, which is a series of principles that they've kind of built out, 12 in total, which talks a little bit about things of highest priority should be satisfying the customer, changing requirements should be welcome, and Agile processes in this case are used to meet a competitive advantage, and on and on. But I think that the summary of Agile versus DevOps is that Agile focuses on process, or in some ways, people would call that ceremony, and people, whereas DevOps focuses on culture and ways in which you can actually bring about a product or a software into production. So it's almost as though Agile is the ground truth of development in the process or the ceremony through which developers and software engineers go through building the software. And then DevOps is the actual delivery of that software to production and the maintenance of it and the continuous integration of it and so forth.
DevOps is more about the ops, right? And Agile is more about the creation process.
Right. And so some people actually say that DevOps is the application of Agile to operations.
Yep.
Which is a fair kind of analogy. It's not exactly that, but it's close, right? And so what I thought what was interesting about all of this is the three different articles that I linked to under the show notes. The first talks about the differences, which is DevOps is Agile applied to beyond the software team, whereas Scrum is kind of the main principle that most people use within Agile, which is welcoming change requirements and focuses more on people over process or documentation.
Well, now hold on. I just want to say, being around software for way longer than I care to admit, introducing changes to software developers has always been a contentious point. Introducing change is bad. Like, developers can really get really fired up about that. Like, it's just like, that's a huge,
is what you think of it as, right?
Scope change to a software developer, good Lord. But Agile seems to work to try and change that, to basically say you need to be more agile in your processes. And, they always told us when we were growing up learning how to write code that you should modularize it as much as possible so that when there is a change that you minimize the effects of that change. Of course, I found in the real world that never really happened because you had deadlines to meet and you're like, hey, I'm writing code. You know what? I'm just going to continue writing code, screw breaking it up into functions, let alone different modules. Like, I'm just writing code because I got to get it out the door. And I think that's why we end up with less Agile. But Agile it seems like more of a process to allow you to have that change. Like Scrum, did Scrum come out of the Agile thing? Because Scrum is a relatively new thing in our culture. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because now people have applied Scrum to all different kinds of things, and I've had mixed success, right? Like some companies meet every day for 15 minutes. I think in a software context, that's a great thing. I don't necessarily know that in another context, I think it speaks more to a lack of technology than it does like needing a Scrum. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and that's why I call Agile more ceremony and process than methodology.
I like ceremony though, because it makes me think we should have like robes and scented candles and stuff like that. Sacrificing something. I don't know.
I mean, sometimes you feel that way after going through, your daily Scrum for weeks on it. But
everyone join the daily Scrum robes.
Scrum robes, everybody. So someone really ought to make those now.
We should get Application Security Weekly.
Scrum
Agile
robes.
Scrum robe. Yes.
I like this idea already. This is terrible.
This has a potential to go places.
This has legs. Next conference, guys. Ask for your Scrum robe.
That's right.
Um, so and anyway, what's interesting about Agile though is it really is an adherence to people and ceremony more than anything else, right? So some people are diligent about adhering to their 15-minute meetings every day, and I feel like DevOps gets away from that and says, "Look, we're just trying to get code into production and make it work and make the development process of that code, quick and into production quick. How you go about developing it, we don't care." Just get us the code fast, get it to us regularly, so that we can get it into production safely. Is all that DevOps cares about, and I think that that's actually not such a bad thing because I feel like in some ways Scrum or Kanban or Agile ceremony in general can be really prescriptive about things that developers don't necessarily love doing. Like you stand up and you meet with your colleagues for 15 minutes, and there are those developers that would rather just be sitting at their cube writing code than spending 15 minutes meeting with their peers, which may not be a good thing either. I mean, that might be, a
Yeah, but
testament
I mean, let's
to
be honest. When you're on something and you're developing software, you'd way rather continue to work on that than really talk to anyone else in the real world. I'm just saying.
proof.
When you're
No,
in the
no,
zone,
definitely.
you're in the zone.
And that's why you have like the big bulky headphones, you're listening to music, and because you don't want anybody to go over to your desk and bother you, right? So yeah, when you hit that flow, you don't want to stop developing by all means, especially if it's first thing in the morning where you're at your peak performance for the day.
Right. Well, but I think there's
Which
some
is
sound advice in there too. I like a Scrum for software development because you can put it later in the day. You can have one meeting every day rather than interrupting your flow at random times for like an
yep.
hour, which I think kind of burns you out. Like think about mentally where you feel after just being in an hour-long meeting where you've talked about maybe 6 or 17 different topics, and you come back and you have to get back in the flow. Like I feel like the longer you take away from that. Whereas if you have a meeting towards the end of each day for 15 minutes, you may go back, catch up on some tickets, maybe leave for the day, at 5 o'clock, come in the next day and have all the next day to focus on writing code. I think that's a great strategy, and I think really speaks to. I like the word ceremony in this. I never thought of it. I like the word ceremony. That's really, really key here.
So I'm not coining that term either. I've heard of it before from other people, which is
Sure.
why I apply it in this situation. But what I found interesting in at least the second article that I highlight under kind of the topic section was contrasting points between DevOps and Agile, which is really what we were trying to get at here. And then I want to talk a little bit about how security fits into this, which is Agile is about rapid and frequent deployment, and it is rarely the goal or even a part of DevOps to have it tries to say that DevOps isn't trying to have rapid or frequent deployment. I think it's actually supposed to be the opposite here based on this article. So I think they've actually got it mixed because in my mind, DevOps is all about rapid and frequent
Sure.
deployment, whereas Agile is all about rapid and frequent development.
Correct.
Which is very different, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the other difference as well, is creation versus deploying, right? Creation is the process of building the software, and deploying it is the process of getting it out to the customer, which is ultimately where the value is received of any development process, right? Just development for development's sake doesn't mean anything until it's in production. But then also
and there's a
specialization.
critical step in there, which is testing and QA that has to happen somewhere in the middle, and
Which is DevOps.
right. But how does that impact into Agile when you're making all of those various code changes? How do you not get into too much technical debt on a daily basis and say, hey, we're doing Agile. Hey, that means we're making 23 changes today. And like, at what point do you get that stuff QA'd? I think ideally for me is that there's a regular automatic check-in process. There's an automatic compilation check. So at the very least, if you're checking in code, it's doing those preliminary checks to say basically if it compiles. Now, a lot of us don't use compiled languages, but I think there's kind of equivalent, kind of runtime checks. Like, does the web service even start up today? Right? That would be kind of the equivalent of a compiled check. Do those checks every couple of hours or whatever, especially if you're doing Agile, right? Then work in. I don't know, Keith, what your recommendation is for various teams to work in a more comprehensive testing or QA process in there, and then how that ties into DevOps, which is just constantly doing QA and releasing.
Well, so a little bit about that is the Agile Manifesto, the 12 principles. The only thing that even comes close to mentioning anything about testing is working software is the primary measure of progress. It says nothing about
How?
tested and
Right.
like, yeah, right. Like it says nothing about that process of it being, a good player in the sandbox with everybody else through integration testing. It talks nothing about, unit testing, whether that's malicious user stories or, security auditing of any kind. It says nothing about working in production. So
It
it
was
just means
definitely
that the
written by
software
a
works.
developer that said this should work a lot.
Right, right. And so it's just like, okay, to that end, I feel like Agile is good for identifying and working on different tasks, whether that's features or bug fixes or what have you. But it falls flat on its face when it comes to talking about doing things like test driven development. You must build the test before you build the feature and then make sure that the feature works according to the test. And then you should have a suite
Wait,
of
hold on.
integration tests.
Go back. You're dropping so much knowledge on me, Keith. How do you build the test before you implement the feature in a lot of cases?
So
That seems
in some
weird.
it, it is having been trying to do more of this myself, it is exceedingly weird, right? Because you want to effectively say that you expect the following value as an output of the function, whether it's a string or a Boolean value or what have
Hmm.
you, and it takes a certain parameter as input and it does something with that input. So I'm being purposely vague because test driven development is hard,
Hmm.
and also it applies to a lot of different places, right? So whether you're connecting to a database or whether it should be a string that you're receiving and somehow that string gets broken when it comes in or what have you, right? So say you get numbers instead of string values or alpha characters. And so you have to effectively come up with ways to say, I expect the input value to be the following. I expect the output of this function to be the following. And then because I don't have a function yet that actually works when I go ahead and write that function, the test itself is easy to write. Now, when I start to write the function, if it's not passing the value that it asks, the
Oh,
test.
yeah, it's a constant test.
Yeah, so it's a test up until the point that the function works the way it should work,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
I pass the following value, it produces the following output, and I'm basically done. Now, that's only a unit test. That's a unit test of the function.
Correct.
It's not testing anything about how that function will interact with or cause problems with other functions or connections to the database, as you kind of talked about there from like a QA standpoint of, is the web server working, let alone is it actually able to talk to the database when it is
Right.
working with the web server. Those are integration tests. So that's where DevOps comes in, I think,
Or
is
integration and regression testing too.
regret.
Should be in my mind in the same phase, right?
They're
Similar
they're
phases anyway.
synonymous in this case. I would
Mm.
actually say regression testing is unit test and integration tests. So it's almost like genus and species, right? A regression test is both a unit test and an integration test, but a wolf is not a dog, right?
Right.
So
Right. Yes.
So that's kind of the way to think about it, right? One is not the other. So um, to that end, I think that Agile as a process of developing is good, especially if you're doing test-driven development in terms of identifying the way that a feature should work, building all of the unit tests in that process. The integration tests might be written by a separate team. It might be written by yourself as part of code coverage. And that's something that you have to identify on check-in. So when a company decides that it's going to go ahead and really push through the DevOps process, one of the first things it really needs to do is say, how much code coverage do we actually have? Because you can't push to production unless you go through QA, and you can't go through QA if the application isn't even working when you've introduced this new function to begin with. So it's almost a cart before the horse problem of you first must have active developers, Agile, then you must have developers that are actually writing unit and integration tests. Then you must make sure the tests run and put it into a QA environment for other kinds of tests to take place, like security, which is when you start to get into DevOps, right? You start to get into
Mm-hmm.
a unified environment to test in. So making sure that they're testing in production like environments. Then being able to provide them with, seeded data to the database so that it can actually then do integration tests beyond the actual application itself, but integration with production like environments.
But
So
should developers write their own tests? Shouldn't QA be writing some of those tests as well? Like, where do you draw the line between the tests that developers are writing and the test that QA is writing?
the answer is yes, both should be writing the test. Now,
Mm.
here's a really crazy thought, and this is where the actual discussion led in terms of the Twitter thread, which is in order for any of this to scale, DevOps and specifically security needs to be a self-service model.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the QA team should be writing tests. The development team should be writing tests. And oh, by the way, the security team should be
Hmm.
writing tests. Because to that end, if you have the test suite, anyone in the development team across your organization, no matter how big your organization is, can probably make use of that test suite in a similar way. So in a lot of ways, it's almost like you have to make sure that the security team is providing them good configurations for a secure production and production environment.
Yeah,
But then
and
also,
someone has to make the determination when you're going through all of those tests, which tests hold up the release and which ones don't. I mean, and there's a lot of variables that come into play, but that's really the one that matters, right? Which
right.
failed test will hold up production and pushing out the release, and which ones won't. And that has to be someone or a team of people that really understands the business, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so also, this gets into a point of discussion which is important as well, which is how tightly coupled is the development process with operations or with other parts of the business, right? So, to the extent that if an application or a feature within an application is tightly coupled with the database team, and the database team needs to make changes in order for every time that the application is changed to actually function in production, that's a problem, right? Because you have a high friction point at that point where you are now depending on people outside of your team or outside of your part of the organization to make changes on your behalf to something else that you can't control. So it's almost a matter of you have to start looking at loosely coupled parts of your organization, or build them so that they can be loosely coupled, right? So you have to have an idea of, okay, if that feature that was introduced fails, can we roll back just that feature and release everything else into production that was built by everybody else on the organization, right?
Right.
So it's not as
And
though
that more comes down to Agile and how you've done the architecture for your software, if you can actually do that, right? I mean, I
right,
would
right,
think that
right.
speaks
So
to your development process.
in fact, Spotify has a good two-part culture video that they've put together that's out on YouTube, and I recently watched it. And what it covered was kind of interesting to me because apparently the way that Spotify releases their desktop application is it's actually feature specific. So if a feature fails within the application from a build process or any of the processes involved in deployment to production, they can effectively just switch off just that change and just that feature. And it doesn't hurt anybody else in the production environment because it's truly loosely coupled, right?
Hmm.
And so to that end, it's interesting because I was thinking about this process a little bit, and there are a few things that you have to think about, which is the level of friction associated with deployment to production, the assurance of the test suite or that tests exist to test the application, also the integrity of the application from the standpoint of how quickly does it fail, right? Like how quickly can you determine that it fails? And then what stops it from going into production based on that failure state? And then finally, that latency, which is that speed aspect, right? So an agile team can develop software quickly, but it can also develop technical debt quickly. So you need to have the DevOps processes in place to determine quick technical debt aggregation and then hopefully quick resolution of that technical debt. But then also building kind of the guardrails or the bumpers for the development team to make sure that, okay, are they being provided with production-like environments? Are those production-like environments secure in the way that they should be from a configuration standpoint? And then from there, can we get the tests to run quickly for the unit tests and the integration tests that the developers have built and QA has built, and maybe even some security tests? But then also, can we run additional testing beyond that as well that may or may not stop the release of the product, such as dynamic application scanning or static analysis scans? And then the other side of all of this is if you don't have any of this in place beyond just an agile development team, you're missing out on all of the metrics and the measurements that you need to determine, is the application development process successful? Are the customers seeing value out of this? Oh, and by the way, is the application secure, right? Because you don't have any of the measurements that you need to take to determine, is this something that we can roll back? And if we're going to roll it back, can we roll it back quickly? Which is part of what I think DevOps offers you the ability to do. So it was interesting how the discussion came about, because I agreed with Ryan that Agile is in fact a part of the process here. But the problem with any given security practitioner writing stories or malicious stories for any development team is a matter of scale. There aren't enough application security people out there to be able to do that for every organization at scale. that just doesn't exist, and it's not reasonable to even assume that that could be possible. But what security can do is it can provide the good configurations, the loosely coupled test suites to be able to go ahead and actually check for vulnerabilities. And then from there, help the business determine what's an acceptable risk and what isn't.
Awesome.
Any additional thoughts, Paul? I linked to a few different kind of articles that talk about DevOps versus Agile. I think that at the end of the day, Agile is a necessary process for development, and then DevOps is the application of Agile methodologies or ceremony to Ops. But I think that Ops goes a step further in that it actually provides the tools, techniques, and procedures or processes to go along with what the software developers have written and pushing it into production. So that was kind of the thought process that went into today's episode, and specifically from Ryan's post that I wanted to make sure we addressed. Any additional thoughts before we talk about learning and tools?
No, I think we're good to move on.
Cool. So a couple of things I wanted to cover that didn't necessarily happen in the last week, but they've recently come out and I wanted to highlight them, was OWASP Top 10 Proactive Controls version 3.0 was released, which I thought was awesome because everybody hears about the OWASP Top 10 or the Application Security Verification Standard, but the OWASP Proactive Controls are for developers. So it's actually an entire document that goes through the things that developers can do to proactively protect their application as part of the development process. So if you haven't seen that, it's on the wiki here under Learning and Tools. It's number 1 for wiki.securityweekly.com. So just check out this episode number 18 and go check out that PDF document because it's comprehensive. It's like 40 pages. Don't necessarily try to consume it all at once, but identify maybe you're working on a registration feature or a login feature or a user profile that accepts input, and then go look at input validation or securing database access or things of that nature. So I thought that was cool and useful. The other thing that, as I'm such a huge fan of Visual Studio Code that recently came out, was Visual Studio Live Share, which is your ability for you to live share your development of code with team members or what have you. So you can collaborate on writing of code at the same time inside of the Visual Studio Code editor. That just totally blew my mind when I saw it. Paul, any thoughts there? Because I don't know if you've checked out VS Code yet. But for me, when I saw this, I was like, yeah, this is literally how you do, paired coding or
what did they call
side-by-side
that?
coding.
What did they call that? Paired coded, side by side coding in teams.
VS Live Share. It was just live share.
But way back in the day when I worked for my first startup, wasn't my startup.
Teams.
It was someone else. Yeah, like team development or something like that. But they used to do that. But that was like 15, 20 years ago. That was a new concept that we should code in teams, like independent of any kind of product. It was kind of like Agile or DevOps, right? It was like a movement in software development. And I don't know. I think your mileage varies as far as being able. I think for certain projects, a certain times you need to code as a team, and I think largely you should maybe not do that. But the situation determines that. And certainly troubleshooting code is certainly, you can always use extra eyeballs on that as well. But there was like a whole thing. I feel like they called it something different. But anyway.
Paired programming is what you're thinking of.
Paired programming. Sure.
Yeah. So the other thing is code reviews, right? Like this is a good way to do remote code reviews with people that you can actually like walk through that as well. Which is awesome.
Is actually a useful feature for sure.
And then the other one that actually went along with this was number 3 under Learning and Tools, which is a site called VS Code Can Do That. And it actually has like all of these just simple little features that exist inside of VS Code that make it a little bit more fun and interesting to use. So I'm being such a big fan of it, including number 8 under there on how to use Docker inside of VS Code, which I thought was awesome.
Oh yeah, I've messed around with that before.
So yeah, it's good. It's just all good. And it's got like 21 different things that VS Code can do, which I thought was great. And then on top of that, there was Waza, which was an open source host and endpoint security tool that is, again, something that I saw. I think they make their money by providing some sort of like professional support or what have you, similar to the Red Hat model. But I thought that this was a cool little project that I wanted to highlight. So go check that out. The last one, though, Paul, it got especially for you.
I want to go back to Waza for a moment. I've played around with similar technologies, specifically OSSec, which they use, and in Elk Stack. I actually tied some of my OSSec to the Security Onion. This I'm definitely going to try because it looks like they're a little more kind of in tune with the features in OS X, and have an Elk stack that's just for that. But this is definitely something I want to check out.
Yeah, so I look forward to your future review of Waza because I
What's
thought that
up?
was a
What's
cool name.
up? Okay.
It's like that. What was that? 90s or early 2000s?
Yeah,
Waza.
yeah, that was a thing. It was.
And then of course the last one that I have under here, Paul, for you is everybody uses lorem ipsum, but not many people use Bob Ross lorem ipsum, which is you can go ahead and have happy text inside of your application as you're testing out the implementation.
Oh, I see.
So it's got quotes per paragraph and just friendly little paragraphs
What did
from
they do?
Bob Ross.
Transcribe his? Wasn't Bob Ross the painter guy?
He was, and he made happy little trees. And
Yeah.
they're not mistakes; they're happy mistakes, or they're happy accidents, is I think what he called them. So
Oh yeah.
I thought that this was hilarious as a way for developers to pre-fill their applications with text from Bob Ross.
Yeah.
So
Instead of the what did the lorem ipsum? What's
I
the
think that's
the
Latin.
meaning?
It's just like a
I
Latin,
know what it is, but like, what was the whole? I didn't understand like where it came from. As like the what does Wikipedia say it is? A placeholder text commonly used to demonstrate the visual form of a document. How did it come to be like that? That text anyway. That's
That
a,
is a mystery.
that's another segment
If
for another time.
if you know the answer, hoodie at
There you
securityweekly.com.
go.
I would love to know. I'll
I
share it
think
with you.
we're gonna get lots of answers.
That'll be good. That'll be good. With that, we are going to take a short break, come back for the news.